My name is Bakari Kitwana, and I am moderating the session. And I'm going to introduce briefly the panelists, and then they're going to each do their thing, and then we're going to jump into some questions. We want to try to make sure we get more back and forth from you guys as much as possible. And so we really want to ask people, if you got a statement and you're not really a question, you might want to limit that to 1 minute or less so that we can kind of keep it moving. All right? Is there a preferred order? Don't matter. Okay, so our task is to focus on the big word revolution. They call it social change. That's social transformation. That's just a nice way of saying revolution. All right? They call it social transformation. They call it social change. But if you know the great activist Grace Lee Boggs and scholar, she called it revolution. That's all you're saying. It's just a nice way of saying revolution. So we want to talk about, we're going to talk about revolution on this panel. The last panel set us up nicely because they started getting into some of these issues and touching on some of the stuff we're going to talk about. But really what we want to talk about is how do we take that next leap from just being aware and being conscious and being engaged to actually shifting the culture. That's what we're going to talk about. And so we're going to do that through the lens of LGBTQ issues and the successes and some say non-successes they've had over the last, say, decade or so. We're going to do it through the lens of what's happening around the nation, and particularly here in Cleveland with policing and the community's attempt to change the narrative of policing. And we're going to do it through the lens of labor in the city of Cleveland and beyond. There's been a lot of talk about the minimum wage increase. And I think the sister here is going to take us a little bit deeper than just that. So let's start with Nancy Marcus. You have the floor.
Thank you.
All right.
So I'm a constitutional law professor. I'll try not to geek out too much, but I've been kind of re-inspired by Angela Davis to completely scrap my original plans for presentation, and I've started all over again. I've got so much history in this now, and every time I dug down to get some more history to add to my presentation, I kept seeing more and more intersectionality. So this has actually been an evolving piece that right up until the moment that I've started talking here. I'm really humbled to be here. I lived in Cleveland until 3 years ago, and my house is pretty close to where Tamir Rice was killed. And LGBT rights has been my pet issue for a decade. My dissertation was on same-sex marriage 10 years ago, before people thought it was going to happen this quickly. Nothing is near and dear to my heart throughout my career than LGBT rights and even same-sex marriage. But when Obergefell came out, I did not care, because Tamir Rice had been killed. I had thrown myself into the issue of racial justice and police reform, and that's all I cared about. So everything I've been working for 10 years, out the window. I've kind of taken a new focus in my scholarship. So I kind of thought when I got called to come today, I was going to be asked to speak about racial justice and police reform, and I was told, no, actually we want you to talk about LGBT issues. I'm like, darn it. So, but listening to Angela Davis, this is a panel about transformation, and I feel transformed just from everything I've experienced already this weekend. Angela Davis's speech really moved me and reminded me of some important truths. And I've already been thinking about issues of intersectionality, but her emphasis on how our issues are connected reminded me that, okay, I am talking about LGBT rights, but it's still connected to racial justice. All of these issues really are intertwined. As Angela Davis said, the modes of violence against people of color and women and LGBTQ people are not separate. And an illustration that Angela Davis mentioned was trans women of color. There is an epidemic of violence, of killing of transgender women of color in this country, and that illustrates just how much intersectionality there is in the violence and oppression. Transgender women of color are killed because they are women of color. They're killed because they're women. They're killed because they're black, and they're killed because they're LGBT. And it's no coincidence that a lot of the forms of oppression that we see mirror each other in dramatic ways, and I'm going to be talking about that in the context of marriage, which I was asked to talk about. So I am going to be talking about the same-sex marriage opinion that came down at the Supreme Court. what it means and what it doesn't mean. Marriage is not the end-all and be-all of either social justice generally or even LGBT rights. Some people really don't care about marriage. It's almost kind of a luxury if you consider a lot of the other forms of oppression we're battling out there. But it's still important. This is an important victory that we had at the Supreme Court. And one of the reasons it's important is because it does illustrate our connectedness through some critical principles that were articulated by the Supreme Court, both in this decision and in past LGBT rights decisions. So here's what Obergefell versus Hodges is the name of the Supreme Court case affirming same-sex marriage. Here's what the case did. It was a combination of cases from 4 different states, including Ohio, and Obergefell was from Ohio. So the named plaintiff in that case was a man in Ohio whose partner was dying. They wanted to get married and have his name on the death certificate. That's really all they were hoping for, is just to be able to have his name on the death certificate so they could be buried next to each other in the cemetery. And that was the case that made history right here in Ohio. The court's decision emphasized some really core critical principles of constitutionality and humanity. The court emphasized the importance of equal dignity. We all have the right to equal dignity and respect in this country, to equal citizenship, to be freedom from stigma imposed on us by the government, and to have a certain degree of liberty and autonomy in our most precious decisions, which is where marriage comes in. And there's a long history of cases. This was not a decision that just came out of the blue. There's a long history of cases leading up to the Obergefell case in which the court has time and time again affirmed these rights to your integrity and your own personhood, to determine who you are. And the marriage cases actually came from a longer line of reproductive rights cases. Those 2 doctrines are very much linked. And the reproductive rights cases all started with one of the most disturbing cases I have to teach, called Buck versus Bell, which is a 1927 case. And that was a case about forced sterilization and eugenics. And it was a case that highlights that intersectionality really is everywhere. At the turn of the last century, eugenics was a program that was developed here in the States in which people of color, poor people, mentally ill people, queer people, disabled people were forcibly sterilized. Anybody who was considered to be a less than by the upper class, white male patriarchy were forcibly sterilized in huge numbers. And the Supreme Court in 1927 actually said that was okay. And not only did the Supreme Court say that was okay, Nazi Germany used that case to cite to justify their eugenics when they were experimenting on people in concentration camps, okay? So we did that. We did that, and we did it to all of us. We did it to people of color. We did it to queer people. We did it to mentally ill people. The woman in that case wasn't even mentally ill. She was committed against her will to a mental hospital. Why? Because she was pregnant. Why? Because her foster stepbrother raped her. She gets pregnant, and so they commit her. And then they forcibly sterilize her because they decide she's an imbecile. Okay. Ugly, ugly, ugly history, but it's all connected. Okay, so Skinner versus Oklahoma was a case that came later. It was another forced sterilization case. The court somewhat reversed, but never really completely overturned Buck versus Bell. And as we know, experiments on people of color continued through the Tuskegee Project, continued through 1972. That was not so long ago. Okay, so in theory, we have this precious constitutional right to autonomy and dignity in our bodies, and but the court's only just starting to really respect that. And this more recent line of cases, through LGBT rights cases, the court's really respecting that. Intersectionality is everywhere. Lawrence versus Texas is the case that overturned Bowers versus Hardwick. Bowers versus Hardwick was the case in which LGBT people were singled out for prosecution of sodomy laws. Even though sodomy technically applies to everybody, they were being singled out. All right, so the Supreme Court reverses itself in Lawrence versus Texas. And this was the second big LGBT rights victory at the Supreme Court level. In that case, And this is one of the pieces I just put together, right, today as I was preparing for the presentation. I'm like, I want to add some history to this because I'm pretty sure there's an interracial relationship in that case. There wasn't just an interracial relationship in that case. Here's what happened. So you had John Lawrence, a 55-year-old gay man. He's hosting two of his friends, Tyrone Garner and Robert Eubanks. Tyrone and Robert have a really rocky relationship. It is an interracial relationship. And Robert, I guess, has a bit of a jealousy streak. So Robert decides that Tyrone is flirting with their host, John Lawrence, and has a bit of a hissy fit, goes out to the street corner to buy a pop, and he calls the cops, and he says, there's a black man with a gun who's kind of going crazy in my friend's apartment. Okay, so the police show up. There's no man with a gun going crazy, but there are two gay men. But the reports that came from the police were interesting because they were not consistent. One police reported he saw the two men having anal sex. One police report said he saw them having oral sex. Two other police said, we didn't see anybody having sex. But that's how the case got started. So again, intersectionality is everywhere. The police were all set to jump on that because their racism instincts were triggered. They get there, they don't see, okay, we'll just transfer our racism to homophobia then, and we'll rest on that basis instead. Yeah. So intersectionality is everywhere, but we ended up actually with a happy ending to that case because that was the case that resulted in basically not just striking down sodomy bans, but the court declaring this fundamental right to liberty and dignity in our personal relationships without government interference. Okay, so all of those cases built up to the same-sex marriage case. So getting back to the same-sex marriage case, what did it do? In Obergefell, the court said everybody has a fundamental right to marry, and that is a right under substantive due process. You can't be deprived of your right to life, liberty, property without due process, and that includes this basic liberty protection and the right to marry, which the court has affirmed over and over again. And there's a long line of marriage cases leading up to Obergefell. Intersectionality is everywhere. Obergefell is Loving. It's basically the same case. So Loving versus Virginia had struck down interracial marriage bans. And pretty much exactly the same rationales were given for interracial marriage bans that were then later given for same-sex marriage bans. And the court applied basically the same analysis. The court said this is a matter of equality and it's a matter of liberty. You can't single out a group of people just because traditionally you haven't allowed interracial marriages, just because traditionally you haven't allowed same-sex marriage. That's not justification for denying a fundamental right to marry the person of your choice. And it's an equal fundamental right. So it's equal liberty. So seeing the connections between the types of oppressions that were committed against people of color that were then repeated against same-sex couples and LGBT individuals, the same arguments are used and the same arguments have been rejected by the Supreme Court for the same reasons. And seeing those connections can really help us work together for future victories for our civil rights. Another doctrinal piece of the puzzle, how did the Supreme Court end up affirming same-sex marriage? The court also, and this is a piece a lot of people are missing, the court also grounded its decision on what's called the doctrine of intimate association, which is like the right to privacy, but it's also grounded in the First Amendment, because the text of the First Amendment says we have a right to association, right? So you also have this freedom of intimate association, which is both about 14th Amendment civil rights protections, but also about First Amendment associational rights. Another important thing about the same-sex marriage opinion is its breadth. It is a broad decision. The court is very clear. It applies to all states. Okay, so same-sex marriage bans in any state are unconstitutional, contrary to the wishes of Kim Davis and her friends. So Kim Davis and her friends, including, I think, most of the Republican presidential candidates, decry this as a doctrinally unsound decision. It is not. As I've explained, it's very much grounded in over a century of precedent building up to this case. But it's not a perfect decision. It is not a perfect decision, and it does not solve all the problems of the LGBT community. It's still against. It's still legal to fire someone, to deny housing, to deny access to public accommodations to people who are queer in about half the country, half the states in this country. And there are still problems with custody and adoption and so many other pitfalls. Marriage rights did not stop all of that. It's just a tiny piece of the puzzle. And so the marriage decision is just, it's a victory, but it shouldn't be overemphasized as the end-all be-all. And we have a problem now with this growing resistance to even accepting it as a valid decision. And religion is starting to be pitted more and more against the civil rights of LGBT people. So, again, intersectionality is everywhere. And Kim Davis, George Wallace, Chief Justice Roy Moore down in Alabama and his clerks are refusing to abide by the Supreme Court ruling. It is George Wallace all over again. I want to, maybe I should have started off with this, but I do want to add a recognition here that when I first started writing about same-sex marriage a decade ago, I got slammed in a Howard Law Journal piece that said she used the phrase civil rights, and civil rights means something specific, and there hasn't been. You can't really compare the two. It's not the same thing. So I do want to acknowledge it's not the same thing. There are parallels, but the level of discrimination, the level of oppression represented by the institution of slavery and segregation, nothing compares to that as far as the severity of the discrimination that has been faced by people of color in this country. So I do acknowledge that. So I don't use the phrase civil rights as much as I used to because I'm sensitive to that, but it's really important to recognize the parallels, okay? So intersectionality is everywhere, and yet I recognize the unique history of oppression and discrimination against people of color. Both and, which brings me to, I am bisexual. And that's hard to say out loud sometimes because that is one of the last pieces of the LGBT puzzle that a lot of work needs to be done. And that's one of the things that's also not great about the Obergefell decision. I started an organization 2 years ago called BiLaw. It's the first ever organization of bisexual lawyers, law professors, and law students. So it's BiLaw. And we filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, begging the court to be inclusive in its language, to recognize it's not just lesbians and gays who get married, but bisexuals get married too, and we're harmed by these bans too. And we outlined all of the harms and dangers of bisexual exclusion or bi-erasure. And I just want to highlight two of the, why is this, who cares? Why does it matter? We're all going to get the same rights. Well, here's why it matters. In the context of custody and immigration specifically, bisexuals face unique harms when we are not recognized as valid people, as having a valid sexual orientation. In the context of immigration, it is life and death. As you know, in a lot of countries, being non-heterosexual can actually result in you being put to death, okay? You can be stoned to death, you can be thrown in prison. Bisexuals are just as likely to be thrown in prison or killed in those countries as gay people, but asylum boards don't understand bisexuality. And when they see a bisexual person, and that person was in a marriage or a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, and now they're in a relationship with someone of the same sex, they think it's a sham relationship. They think they're faking it. And vice versa. If they were in a same-sex relationship in their home country, and then they come here and they, try to marry someone of the opposite sex, same thing. So the problem is when we, as a community, perpetuate bisexual erasure, then asylum boards continue to not get it. And when asylum boards don't get it, people's lives are at risk, are in danger. Custody. It is so common for bisexual people to lose custody or to be denied custody or visitation or adoption because bisexuals are viewed as unstable. Okay, there's a lot of stigma attached to bisexuality. Again, it's perpetuated by us. It's perpetuated by the LGBT community. Because bisexuals are being erased by the LGBT community itself. We were deliberately, strategically, consciously left out of the litigation briefing that went to the Supreme Court. And Obergefell wasn't the first time. That's been happening since Romer versus Evans. That's been happening since the first victory in Colorado at the Supreme Court level, where the briefs, even though the Colorado amendment that was struck down that case, it said there should be no civil rights protections for any lesbian, gay, or bisexual people. The amendment language itself was bi-inclusive, but the LGBT rights lawyers said, for purposes of this lawsuit, we will define the class of people harmed by this amendment as lesbians and gays. And the Supreme Court said, oh, okay, well, we will too then. And from then on, it's always been lesbian, gay, bisexuals. It's never been mentioned by the Supreme Court, not once, since Romer, because LGBT rights lawyers told them to exclude bisexuals. Okay, so that broke my heart, that we've actually filed an amicus brief. I wrote an article. I sent it to all of the LGBT rights lawyers involved in the case. Please, please, please stop erasing bisexuals. And they just ignored it. So once again, bi-erasure is being perpetuated by the courts and by LGBT rights lawyers themselves. Why is this happening? Yale Law professor Kenji Yoshina wrote a really beautiful article where he illustrates, he's got all the root causes of bi-erasure, and it's all about people scared of losing their own identity, whatever. That's great stuff. But I am experiencing another piece of the puzzle that I think, again, intersectionality is everywhere. This is something that the LGBT rights community is guilty of. It's something that I think every civil rights community wrestles with, and that's too often advocacy groups sacrifice principles for political expediency. So LGBT rights groups are being told by focus groups and by big money that the mushy middle doesn't like the B word. It kind of makes people uncomfortable. So let's just frame our messaging around what the mushy middle wants. Okay, when our own advocacy groups are doing that and throwing us and our principles under the bus to win a political battle, okay, first of all, they're not going to win the political war. They're just winning the immediate battle. But they're forgetting their role. We're supposed to be leading. We're supposed to be educating. We're not supposed to be following the biases of the mushy middle. So that's something that I've been grappling with lately. It's a universal problem. Intersectionality is everywhere, right? I mean, these are universal problems that we're dealing with. So, as Angela Davis said, we really can't lose sight of our collective struggle. So in honoring our equal value, both in society in general and within the social justice movement specifically, like Angela Davis said, we can experience joy in being part of something larger. And I am experiencing that joy this weekend. I don't know about you guys, but I really am. But again, also very humbling because this is really important work that we're doing. So yeah, I was asked to talk about marriage, but my marriage talk really isn't about marriage. It's about something bigger. It's about these overarching principles of equal respect and dignity that the court recognized in these cases, and the need for us all to be inclusive and to recognize in each other our equal humanity and the parallel forms of oppression that we do face. And I think it's important for the social justice movement to simultaneously honor our diversity and our differences. You have to honor our differences and diversity, but also honor our equality at the same time. And those two can happen at the same time. Our histories are intertwined, and I think that, and I do feel humbled being here as a white person because, again, what's weighing on my heart is Tamir Rice and all of the police killings and all the violence and the protests across the country. I mean, I'm thinking about racial justice these days more than the LGBT rights issues I've been focused on the past 10 years. So I'm very aware of my role here as an ally. And so I just want to end with a note about being an ally, which is that as an ally in the racial justice movement, or those of you who are people of color who are heterosexual, as your roles as allies in the LGBT rights struggle, I think our responsibility is to bring our friends to where we are, because there are so many people who just aren't awake. They're just not awake, and it's our responsibility as allies to wake up the people in our communities and bring them to the table, and to recognize that our histories are intertwined, and intersectionality is everywhere, and we have to build upon our connections to preserve our equal dignity and humanity. So.
All right, thank you. That was a lot of great information, and I'm really glad you went through that history to kind of bring us up, because I think it's just so essential. People think that sometimes these movements just kind of spring up out of nowhere. But it's a long history, and it takes time to get to the point. One of the things I hope you will think about. I don't want to disrupt the flow of the other presenters, but when you were talking, it made me think about, as we think about revolution, as we think about real social change, what do you think are the building blocks that are present in the LGBT movement that some of the other movements aren't present, that you're seeing that kind of success, like you're at this public policy level of change, and you have these other movements that we get in a task force.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? So I don't know if you want to give a brief response to that.
Yeah, we have privilege. Mm-hmm. We absolutely have privilege. If you compare the LGBT rights lobby to the civil rights lobby for racial justice, we have a responsibility because we have privilege. There's no doubt. So, yeah. I'll stop there because I think you all know what I'm saying here, but I'm very aware of that, and it's incumbent on me to remind my allies in the LGBT rights movement of that, and to be as inclusive and to fight for social justice in our LGBT rights conferences and causes and dialogues as well. I think it's privileged.
I'm curious if there's some other building blocks that you see present. You talked about that history and that evolution, but just curious. I won't put you on the spot. So let's go to Yanela Sims, and she is going to be presenting with Sandra Ellington, and they're going to be speaking with us about labor and the labor movement.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what the low-wage worker looks like. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about what the low-wage worker looks like. I want to kind of bring it back to Cleveland, to the Northern Ohio area, just because I think it's important. Like, we're having a global conversation. We're having a conversation that spreads across the country. But, right here in our backyard, we have people that are struggling to be able to buy groceries and feed their children. So janitorial workers in Cleveland are, predominantly Black women and immigrants. One way to lift that group of people out of poverty is for them to have a collective voice, for them to have stability, for them to have a collective bargaining agreement. Right, and a lot of people have issue with unions. They think unions are the reason why, workers kind of get away with doing whatever. The union is the reason that the police gets to shoot kids on the street and not be punished for it. And I get that and I understand that. And there's a piece of education that needs to come along with that, because unions have historically been the way for people to come out of poverty. Unions have been a way for people to band together to say, I'm doing the same work that you're doing, and we deserve to be treated as equals. And the only way that we're going to be able to be treated as equals is if we get together and make some noise and have our voices heard and make something happen. Now, that being said, I think, organizing is a bigger thing than just that group of workers that work at this particular site that work under a specific collective bargaining agreement. Organizing workers is something that the community needs to be involved in. It doesn't need to be a separate issue. Union issues don't need to be separate issues from social justice issues, and social justice issues don't necessarily need to be a different issue from unionizing. And I think you talk about a revolution. I think changing or shifting the way unions are seen in our society and shifting the way that we separate, the organized workforce from the workforce that is, fighting for a minimum wage of $15 and rising up to say, we want 15 and a union. That's how we build a revolution. We bridge that gap, and we stop separating workforce A from workforce B, and we stop making workforce A the issue as to why folks are coming in from other countries and taking our jobs. You know, we need to change the way that we look at organized labor and understand that organized labor has helped propel, you know, organized labor gave people the 8-hour workday. Organized labor gave people paid holidays. Organized labor helped create a situation where you don't have children, underage children working in sweatshops and being injured. Organized labor did that. And organized labor didn't just do it for the people that work under that collective bargaining agreement. Organized labor did that for everybody that has a job. So when we talk about that revolution, I'm gonna keep coming back to that because that's the point that we're trying to have a discussion about here. We have to educate the general public because people have this vision of what unions are, and some people get it. You know, some people understand the background, and some people understand how unions have helped society, but a greater number of people think that unions are the problem, which for me is kind of ridiculous, but you know, I'm a union person, so I'm able to kind of see past that. And you know, we talk about right to work. Has anybody like heard of what right to work is, or? Yeah, so that's like kind of knocking on our back door. It's coming to Ohio. You know, it's just a matter of time. It's not an issue of if, but when. And exactly, and we all have to make sure that that does not happen. Because back in 2008, I want to say, when we had, you know, FB5, we had to come together as a community of working people, regardless of whether you were in the police union or whether you were a janitor or whether you're a food service worker, because we understand that as soon as you start chipping little pieces and parts away and you start attacking working people, you start attacking the working poor, you start creating situations where people have no voice, they have no way of trying to lift themselves out of poverty, then you're reinforcing the fact that 1% is going to continue to erode whatever options working people have to kind of get out of bad situations. Just want to give a few little facts here. I know people that came before me had a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers, and I'll just share some of what I have. But union member, the median usual weekly earnings is $970 versus those who are not in the union, which is $763. These are, approximate numbers. So if you are a low-wage worker and you happen to be in a union, your wages and benefits could potentially be 20% more than that same low-wage worker who does not have a union. When you're talking about the actual pay rate, your availability for decent health care that is usually paid by the employer fully, or it's affordable enough where you can contribute to that, versus maybe a construction worker or a higher level employee who would still have a gain of about 6%. According to the U.S. Census, 37%, so I'm bringing it back to Cleveland now, 37% of Cleveland residents live in households with incomes under the poverty line. It's ranked third among large cities in proportion of residents who live under the poverty line, third. The city is second only to Detroit in the percentage of children living in poverty, just more than 54% of the children in Cleveland. The labor force participation in Cleveland metro area is lower than the average, with a lower proportion of adults who are actually working. Many non-union workers live in poverty. They rely on public assistance, and when you talk about, people who are getting public assistance because they just don't have the basic means to take care of their families, and you talk about the corporations who believe that, well, we should just get rid of public assistance, then you start, I see it as an opportunity, right? I see it as an opportunity to start that revolution and start having discussions with the corporate structures who tend to want to shift the real message. We know this is the truth over here, but corporate is going to say, well, this is it, and we're going to have more of the population believing that, it's okay for us to not pay our workers a decent wage, for them to be able to take care of their families and to remove themselves from, and I heard this today and I think it makes a lot of sense, from a incarcerated situation. You're not in jail, you're not locked up, but because you're struggling to make ends meet and to take care of your family and to feel respected when you go to work, you're in an incarcerated type of situation. And we need to start looking at how we can pull together our resources, pull together our knowledge, pull together our experiences, and educate each other so that we can change that narrative, so that we can raise everybody. We need to raise the bottom up so that everybody is able to be able to function and survive and take care of their families. Because at the end of the day, you want to be a contributing member of society. You want to be able to take care of your kids. You want to be able to feed your family. And I think we need to really look at how labor connects all of those pieces when we talk about social justice and that revolution.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I don't have a degree and I don't have any numbers. I'm just that worker that she talks about.
Oh, that's right.
So I'm gonna take it from a worker's point of view. I've been a part of the union almost 15 years. I'm a janitor and proud of it. I'm worthy and I'm not worthless. We are not invisible. We are real people with homes, families, children. We've put through college, we buy homes, cars. We are union workers. And it's not just union workers, we are working people who want a decent wage and a living wage. So when you see us knock on the door with our purple shirts or our blue shirts, please know that we're trying to do the right thing for everybody. I am also a shop steward. So I got the target on my back, but there's no fear in my heart because I know somebody got my back. When I speak, I pull out that contract and say, no, it says this. I get a 30-minute break, and I will get all 30 minutes. And if you call me from when I'm eating, I will go back and start all over again because my collective bargaining agreement said so. And they will do so. So in saying that it feels good to know that I don't have to depend on the system anymore because I had to at one time. See, I was just passing through. And then I met Yanela, and she said, well, you're going to school, well, won't you just going to be the steward just for a little while? I said, okay, I'm going to do it for a little while. 15 years later, I'm still the steward and on the executive board. It feels good knowing that my son is in college and he can still depend on my health care. He won't have to be stressed, him or my daughter. It feels real good not to depend on that system. That is what a working person wants. They do not want to stand in the food line. When I organize, it breaks my heart when a person works 5 hours a day and sometimes makes minimum wage, and I'm like, huh? What do you mean? And you working for a multi-billion-dollar company. They ain't lose nothing in 9/11, they gained. Because know that you have to clean always. Know that when that person's in that restroom, that if there is blood and it's AIDS, we are the first line of defense. I put that suit on, put on my goggles, because my collective bargaining unit contract states that you must give me the equipment or I will shut the bathroom down, it won't get done. So you must have that equipment for me. So it feels so good to know that if my employer don't do the right thing, I have someone that has my union has my back. And I tell my workers, sometimes you get tired and they'll try you because they think you don't know. But I explain to them that we can do it this way or we can do it that way. I speak very well in front of a camera. I don't mind telling the truth. But people need to understand that we are not invisible. We are people. We don't want handouts. We want to work for it. We just want a decent wage. It shouldn't just be the janitors. It should be window washers, the man that flips your hamburger, the street sweeper, the garbage man. You need a decent wage in order to make this country grow. See, what people don't realize, when Ford, LTV went out of business, they became janitors. People don't realize a lot of my members owned their own business at one time, and people don't realize that they had no choice. So in that doing, they said, well, shoot, those individuals say, well, let's lift this poverty wage, let's lift it up. And it makes sense. It's a hard struggle sometimes when you sit at the table and they tell you zero and you know you just cleaned like 40 toilets and God knows what was on it, and you don't give me nothing. But it feels good knowing that, okay, this is what's really going on and this is what the money they really have. And then their mind is really blown because they think because you're a janitor, because you're cleaning the toilet, you don't know nothing, you keep your head in the toilet, but we don't. So just know that we are not invisible, that we don't want a handout, we just want help. Come, if we're rallying, come join. Because it's about everybody, not just some of us, it's all of us.
All right. You gonna come up here? Just give me 1 second. I want to ask them one question also, and then we're gonna bring Julia up. Love the presentation, ladies. I want to ask you, just as I'm listening to you both talking, two things came to mind. I was just curious just to get your, quick reaction to it. One was just to kind of spin it back to some of this contemporary struggle that's happening with young people around the country. The football team at the University of Missouri, who basically decided they were not going to play ball until certain demands were met, kind of a work stoppage, right? And some people have also compared it to an economic boycott, forcing, kind of stopping the school from being able to make money off of the players so they can meet some demands. I'm curious to hear your reaction to that. And then the second thing, also contemporary discussion, has been this week in New York. The governor said they're going to pass the 15 minimum wage for state workers, right? But one of the interesting things, one of the debates that kind of erupted, like on social media, was between people who said, well, the state workers, they might deserve $15 an hour, but the people working in the service industry at fast food or whatever, they don't deserve $15. I'm just kind of curious to hear your reaction to those things.
Let me say this. If a person is ill, and they're flipping your hamburger. This is your new industry. This is your LTV Steel. This is your Ford. They deserve it because they're giving a service. We all give a service. Just because I don't have a degree or they say it's unskilled does not mean you don't deserve $15. Everybody deserves a living. Because see, if they're not making $15 or they're not making enough, they might fall back into their old ways. So we should, as a country, need to not do that. We need to change that. That whole idea that because you flip a hamburger, you don't deserve $15. That makes absolutely no sense. We live in one of the richest countries in the world, and we can't get it together.
That's right.
I mean, really though.
That's right.
We got enough money to go fight a war, to go help somebody else build their country, but you can't give somebody working at McDonald's $15 and some health care. But do you want somebody who's sick flipping your hamburger? I'd rather for you to stay home, get well, and then come flip my hamburger, because you're going to spread them germs to everybody else.
That's right.
Come on now. Let's be real. McDonald's is, how much does he make? 18, whatever that number was. You can't give up $15. Like, there are no Brinks trucks at the cemetery. God, you can't, my grandmother, God rest her soul, but she told me this. You can't buy your way into heaven, and when you get to hell, you can't pay your way out. So what you need all the money for?
Yeah, so I think we're talking about the redistribution of wealth, and these corporations who make so much money, they don't know what the hell to do with it, but they're so concerned. I think it's a bigger issue than I don't want to pay these workers $15.
Right.
The issue is I don't want to lose my status in society. I don't want to give anybody else any additional power. I don't want them to start climbing that ladder and get too close to where I am. That's what the real issue is. It's not about we can't afford to pay $15 an hour, because we all know that is definitely not the case. But it's an issue of power. And if they find the way that they feel that they can keep the power that they have is to keep people poor and to keep people struggling. And in that revolution, we have to flip that, and we got to make some noise, and we got to do whatever it is that we need to do to start breaking that barrier down and to start redistributing that power, because otherwise the situation that we're in right now is the situation that's going to continue until we make our voices heard and we say, you know what, we got your game, we see it, and we're about to break it down. That's the only way that anything in our society is going to change, because for too long, the power has been in the hands of the wrong people. And I think now we're getting to a point where we recognize it, but not only do we recognize it, but we're in that movement. We're in the movement to try to change it. And no, it's not going to happen overnight. And we might get tired and we might decide, you know what? The easiest thing to do is to just take whatever we can get and keep it moving. But down the road, that's not going to help anybody, and it's going to keep making it worse. So that being said, I think that when we start looking at it from a perspective of power versus money, we understand that we got a bigger struggle and we got to work a lot harder to get to where we need to get to. But there's always opportunity in a crisis. This is a crisis, but there's also an opportunity to start stripping that power down and putting power back in the hands of regular people, not those few folks that are at the top.
All right. All right. We're getting warm in here now. We're warming it up. Y'all ready for them questions? It's almost time. Now we're going to really bring the hammer up. Julia Shearson, Executive Director of CARE Ohio and founder of Cleveland Aid. What's the other group?
Well, co-founder. Co-supporter of the Collaborative.
Collaborative, that's right. Okay, so we're going to come on to the police abolition issue is what I call it.
I was too agitated to sit down and present. I am too agitated, so I'll stand if that's okay. I'm very honored to be here. At the same time, I feel a little punished because I have to go after so many brilliant people, and I'm the only thing standing between you and Rebel Diaz. So it's like, wow. So I'm going to skip through some of my prepared remarks because I want to move a little bit faster here. I just want to say, though, that the intellectual foundations of the social justice efforts here in Cleveland are second to none around the country, and that's in a large part due to the leadership of people such as visionaries such as Dr. Rhonda Williams. Just being in a room with her, I am transformed. So she's transformed a lot of people. I mean, I know it's about all of us, but there are some people who are gifted to help transform others, and I just want to, I can't but a shout out to her. I also want to thank all the people in Cleveland who have been working as catalysts for change. There is a lot of people out there doing this work, and I want you, if you can't contribute financially to this event today, I hope you will go out and talk to people who weren't here today and tell them about what happened here and keep this thing moving. Now, some people have said, come on, Cleveland, where are you? They have not seen as much street protest out of us as in some other cities. Now, there's been a lot of protests here, in fact, and a lot of arrests and a lot of demonstrations. So we have taken to the streets. But beyond that, for those who are not able to get to the streets due to work and family responsibilities and being busy just trying to put food on the table, make no mistake, all people of conscience in the city of Cleveland, we have taken to the streets in our hearts and our minds, and in fact, in our hearts and minds, we are laying our bodies down in front of the Injustice Center, that monumental monument to utter failure, that massive stone edifice to mass incarceration, that abomination that is the Justice Center, where European American attorneys and judges fill their briefcases and satchels with the woeful charges laid heavily on the backs of their African American brothers. Now, I respect attorneys and judges. They solve a lot of problems, and I'm going to speak about some of the courageous judges and attorneys in this city. But it is a deeper problem when a whole system, including whole classes of professionals and an entire insecurity apparatus, profit on the woes and sorrows of those indicted, convicted, and condemned. When I started this work 13 years ago, I did not really know or understand the depth of what indict the system meant. Well, I'm starting now to know. So when people say, "Come on, Cleveland, where are you?" I say, "Yeah, we're here." And I say, there is a riot, a rebellion in our minds and hearts, because we are carefully thinking and organizing, talking and connecting to make manifest that we are not going to take this anymore in our city. We will indeed try to uproot this, and we will indeed try to stop this. This is a thoughtful city, and the people here are on the move in many, many ways. And what has happened here has indeed reverberated around the country. There is a lot going on, and the powers that be, they know it, rest assured. Now, some reason that some things didn't kick off around the country after the 137 shots, when people were shot more times than Bonnie and Clyde, was because the incident was so bad, very bad, that knowledge of it was suppressed, in the sense that there is talk on the street that some African American leadership rejected outsiders coming to Cleveland to blow this big nationally, because they did not want this to look bad on a city that was trying to make its renaissance under the leadership of an African American mayor. Now, that's a renaissance for the few. But the people that suppressed the national knowledge about the 137, they did that at the expense of the many. If the 137 had taken off nationally, we might not have had Tanisha and Tamir, Mike Brown, Walter Scott, and the many that came after that. All right. Now, I have just a few minutes to talk to you about some really complicated work, legal work, and that's been happening. I'm going to talk about two distinct actions and two groups, and I'm going to try to do it as quickly as I can. And these groups are trying to help us dismantle the kind of thoughtless, callous, routinely cruel, and derelict practices and modes of unenlightened thinking that allow the government to kill its own people. Regardless of what the so-called expert reports say, it is not reasonable that Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams are dead. It is not reasonable that Tanisha Anderson is dead. It is not reasonable that Tamir is dead. It is not reasonable that John Crawford is dead, and on and on. Reason can play no role in such deaths. It is also not reasonable that some people are living in the lap of luxury in our city, and others like Tim and Melissa were living in homeless shelters and were chased like prey, surrounded and gunned down. Even animals in the cruelest hunt are not shot up like that. Now, after the deaths of Tim and Melissa, several groups, and this is the work I'm going to talk to you about, including the NAACP, the ACLU, and the Task Force for Community Mobilization, and others called for the Department of Justice to come to town. That didn't happen automatically, and as a matter of fact, the DOJ didn't even want to say, well, we're coming because of Tim and Melissa, right? They had to say, well, you know, it's a number of different things, but we know that that was the straw that broke the camel's back, that even the, you know, dominant culture, you know, couldn't have that amount of violence on the street. They'll permit a certain low-level amount of crushing, you know, cruel violence, but like even that like somewhat woke people up. So the DOJ did step in, and in March 2013, they launched this very long investigation. It went on for almost 2 years until they were about to release the report, but they actually had to delay it because Tamir Rice, it was inconvenient that Tamir Rice died. They had to delay the report a couple days, so it was delayed till December 4th, 2014. And for those who haven't read it, I mean, people know gutturally and viscerally what's going on in the streets of Cleveland, but in a certain sense, when you read it, it is even worse than you can imagine. That is a 58-page scathing report about systemic failures in the Cleveland Division of Police, systemic failures that the Cleveland Division of Police still, and our mayor is still not admitting, is actually systemic. And that's a real problem. Now, the main finding was that the Cleveland Division of Police are engaged in a pattern and practice, not just a few, you know, not just a few bad apples, not just a few bad acts, but a pattern and practice of excessive use of force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Now, can you imagine writing a report like that without mentioning the word race? 58 pages and the word race is not even mentioned, okay? Now, the U.S. attorney said, well, you know, okay, it is about race, but, you know, when you don't mention it, it makes it very hard to hold people accountable on issues related to race. But in any case, there are a lot of weaknesses in the findings, things that they didn't investigate. You know, we can talk after the break about the things that they missed. But they did find a kind of us versus them kind of siege mentality, a cultural militarization. We all know about all that. So, what was happening, though, was before this report was released, a group of people started meeting, some at the NAACP, some at other places. There were a lot of different activists coming together around this issue. There's a lot of people who have been working on this for many, 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 many years. So it's not like some group suddenly came along and, you know, starts doing the work. But you have to give a lot of credit to an attorney called James Hardiman. He's kind of a really quiet guy. But he was getting a lot of people together to talk about like how we were going to handle the legal issues around this, like how this consent decree was actually going to get written. And the collaborative came together and basically was saying, look, we need an independent, representative, stakeholder, grassroots group that can go out into the community and gather input about what we want the Cleveland Division of Police to look like, because they work for us, right? We want a whole cultural sea change. We don't just want reform that, like Angela Davis says, allows the, you know, the handcuffs to be placed a little bit more gently on people as we shuffle them into mass incarceration, right? We want systemic cultural shift in the way the Cleveland Division of Police treat us. But, you know, the Cleveland Division of Police is a, you know, it's a quasi-military organization. It runs on structures, rules, and procedures. And if you don't have the proper structures, rules, and procedures to keep them, you know, under control, they will go out of control. So it takes a lot of work to put together the information that is going to make them operate in a way that is just and legitimate and that is, you know, culturally acceptable in our community. So they're more like peace officers rather than, you know, what they are now. So in any case, the collaborative met for many, many weeks, gathered information from many, many people, and we wrote like a 20-page document. There were 33 different reports that went into making the consent decree what it is. A lot of it is really much reflective of what the community wanted in terms of policing. We did a ton of research on different cities, New Orleans, Cincinnati, Portland, you know, all over the country, New Haven, Seattle, to look at the suffering of other communities and tap their wisdom about how they tried to solve the problem of this, you know, kind of like unleashed monster in their community. So we spent a lot of time, and a lot of that information got into the consent decree. I can talk a lot more after the, in the question about how the procedures worked and how we, worked really hard to get what we wanted in it, but not get played, and it was a very complicated process. Now, that consent decree is far from perfect. I mean, you've got the Inspector General. We pushed so hard to get that. I think our group was the one that got that independent Inspector General because we studied New York and how New York got that Inspector General. But in Cleveland, the Department of Justice got out-negotiated by the Cleveland Division of Police, and the Inspector General is reporting to the Chief of Police. So, like, okay, how can he inspect if he has to report to the very same person who he's trying to, oversee? So that's a real problem. And we tried to go to the DOJ. Once they got all the input from the community and they got what they wanted, we told them, look, we want to see this thing before it goes out. Well, no. They snuck down to the federal court, and they got the judge to give them kind of like signed, sealed, and delivered before we even had a chance. There was a status conference with the judge. We thought it was a simple status conference. Lo and behold, they ripped that thing in and got it signed, sealed before we could actually get our critiques in. I mean, we told them these things are wrong. You've still got problems with the use of force investigations. You've got a lot of issues going wrong here. You can fix this thing better. Well, they weren't having any of it. But in any case, because of that, we filed an amicus brief in federal court and said, look, these are the things that you have to fix. We're still fighting. We're still struggling on that. And we're looking for people to help join the fight in that. Now, I want to move on quickly because I don't want to, I want to make sure that we get out of here in a reasonable time. I also want to talk to you about a group called the Cleveland 8. How many have you heard about a little bit about the Cleveland 8? Okay, looks like a lot of people. Brother Bakari is part of the Cleveland 8, Dr. Rhonda Williams, Reverend Jawanza Colvin, Edward Little, criminal justice consultant, Reverend Vernon at the Word Church, Rachel Smith, who really was one of the great legal minds behind it. She's not an attorney yet, but I mean, she knows the work inside and out about what we did. Now, June 8th, I think it was, how did this group get going? June 8th, I got a text from Ed Little telling me to come to a meeting in the basement of a church. And he texted, and that's profound for a Muslim, that I get to be part of this, and like I'm invited to come and be part of this community. I'm so honored to be part of that. Because the Muslim community is pretty much put on the margins of the margins of the margins right now. It's okay to kill us, but certainly don't invite us to meetings. So it's like, the people in Cleveland are not going to be terrorized by me, even though they did put me on the terrorist watch list, right? The FBI put me on the terrorist watch list. You'll see that in my bio. That was a freaking 7-year battle to get myself off of that list. Had a hard time serving my community when I had to, make sure that people didn't think I was a terrorist for 7 years. They really knew how to try to decapitate the movement in this case. But in any sense, I got this text, and it's like he texted me a couple sections of the Ohio Revised Code. And not being a lawyer, I had no idea even what section of the code he was referring to. But when I looked them up, I realized this was a very serious action that we were about to undertake. And I have to admit, it was a little scary to suddenly be getting my signature notarized in an attempt to use my name and the names of 7 others to directly challenge the system. But the great thing was that I was in such illustrious company. The feeling of being part of such a great group made any hesitation and fear fade away. The concept of confidence and strength in numbers was really, really important. After a couple meetings, okay, I got 2 minutes here. After a couple meetings, we took the unusual and bold step of signing what were called citizen affidavits under the Ohio Revised Code to bring the issue of Tamir Rice's killing before a reviewing official, in this case, Municipal Court Judge Arnold Adrian, and to use our witness statements to ask for a probable cause arrest for Timothy Loebman and Frank Garnback. On the basis of the fact that we saw it too, meaning we saw the killing too on the video and we witnessed it, that we would use the conduct we saw to call for probable cause, that the officers violated the laws in our view, that they should be charged with aggravated murder, because when you kill somebody under 13, it is aggravated murder, murder, involuntary manslaughter, reckless homicide, negligent homicide, and dereliction of duty. So there were criteria for the judge to accept these affidavits. We met those criteria. And then we held a joint press conference, and that was the only day that I ever felt the Justice Center was an important place, because it was this amazing prop for this group of 8 very powerful-looking people to come walking down the steps like we were coming out of a movie. And I would say that Joe Worthy of the New Abolition Association, I would say that dark aviator glasses and social transformation will always be linked and will always be in style because of Joe Worthy and the group coming down. And, I'm talking about this because this wasn't about us. This wasn't about us. This was about Tamir. But the sense of pride and confidence, because even though we knew that almost nobody knew what the heck we were about to do down there, we knew with strong intuition that such an action was the right thing at the right moment. We were in the zone, and there is no other way to describe it. In less than 48 hours, we're a year later, we are a year later, and we haven't got progress as much as we need from the county prosecutor's office. In fact, he's an obstacle to progress. But in less than 48 hours, on June 11th, 2 days after we filed our affidavits, Judge Ronald Adrian, a venerable reputation with 30 years experience, who must have slept very little in those 2 days, came back with an opinion that provided a probable cause ruling. And the famous lines from the judge's ruling still reverberate around the city and around the country. He said, the video in question, in this case, is notorious and hard to watch. After viewing it several times, this court is thunderstruck by how quickly this event turned deadly. Now, in a well-considered 10-page opinion, he found probable cause with respect to violations of murder, involuntary manslaughter, reckless homicide, negligent homicide, and dereliction of duty for Timothy Loehmann, and negligent homicide and dereliction of duty for Frank Garnback. The words "elated" headlined our response, but the feeling of victory did not last long because we did not get the arrests that we wanted, right? We were seeking those arrests. In any case, that's still up on appeal now. I guess I want to just say that in all my years of civil and human rights work, this was likely one of the best days. We were elated, we were powerful, and we were clear about what we wanted, and that's what Angela Davis told us to do, right? We were clear about what we wanted, and in a dignified and respectful way, we demanded it, and in large part, we got what we sought at that moment. Now, that was only one step. I have a lot more to say on this, but I'm going to sit down so that the audience can talk, and we'll talk a little bit about our guerrilla video and all the things we did after. But this work was only done in community with many, many people encouraging each other and standing on the shoulders of many of the people that have been working in this movement for a long time. Thank you very much. If I said anything offensive, that was due to me. Anything that came from good, that's from the divine in my eyes.
Right. Wow, that was a lot. I'm not going to ask you anything because we got to get the audience in, right? We got about, 15 minutes? So if you have questions, can you come to the mics? And if you got a statement, we're not going to have a lot of time for that. You're going to have to keep it to about 20 seconds. But we'll take a question, though. Shall we start with the sister?
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. They were fine and very informative. I do have a couple of questions. The first question has to do with, when you considered, and I'm talking to Nancy Marcus right now, when you considered the response to the question that you were asked initially, and you said, quote, "We have privilege," were you thinking about African American, lesbian, gay, trans people like me who don't have that same privilege when you were talking about what made it work and what didn't? And my second question has to do with the intersectionality and the parallels that we've been talking about also have to do with location, with geography. And the fact that those 137 shots were fired within walking distance of my house, not in Cleveland, but in East Cleveland, a even poorer city than Cleveland, with also a black mayor, and the police were not, the East Cleveland police were not involved in those shootings. So I'm wondering if anyone's talking about the geographical intersectionalities and parallels.
Excellent questions.
Yeah.
You want to take the first one?
So Leslie, thank you for calling me on that, because I know that's what it sounded like. And I was cringing afterwards. I'm like, wow, that sounds like I'm talking about, you know, we white people have privilege. I was actually thinking about HRC. I was thinking about our lobby groups and how right now we kind of have the ear of, you know, Hillary Clinton. And it's, you know, so I wasn't, but I want you to call me on that because
I do have to push back on that,
Okay,
because
sure.
those are not my lobbying groups. My
Thank
lobbying
you.
group is the National Black Justice Coalition, for example, has very little money whatsoever. And so when you say our, or when we talk in terms of our, and we're talking about the intersectionality
Yeah.
and the parallels of our struggle, we have to be aware that our struggles are not identical, and that some of the poorest people on the planet are black lesbians, you know? So let's be clear here, and our death rates are different, and all of that is different. So we have to be very clear when we're talking those things. And you know I love you, Nancy, but I
love
have
you
to call
too.
you.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and I want to be called on that. And it's something that, you know, when I say we, you know, again, I'm thinking about the conferences I've been to, but they have been predominantly white because they don't have reduced fees for low-income people. I mean, the people who have the ear of DC, the people who've been successful in some of these battles have been very white, upper-class groups of people, and I think that that is something that we absolutely need to change. Yeah, we need to be more conscientious of that, so thank you.
Someone want to address the geographical intersectionality?
Yeah, I guess I would say when I said Cleveland, of course I'm thinking of the broader region of that, and you're absolutely right that the Cleveland Division of Police, not only did they run roughshod over the city of Cleveland, they ran roughshod over the city of East Cleveland, and of course East Cleveland itself, the whole neglect of the city and the way that East Cleveland has been treated, the way different places are treated by the authorities is definitely problematic. From what I understand, though, there were people that wanted to come, national leadership, African American, very powerful leadership, wanted to come into the city to just talk, you know, just talk more about this 137 shots. But from what I understand, and there's people in the audience probably can be talked, you know, who were in those rooms, maybe know a lot better than I do, that they were told, you know, stay away, we got this, you know, our mayor's got this, because we want to, you know, we want to keep this on the low down because we don't want to affect the quote unquote, you know, renaissance of Cleveland, which of course is, you know, a renaissance of, you know, taking land from poor people and giving it to rich people. But, and I would go even further to say the reason we need to have unsafety in our cities is because we need to make it so unlivable for poor communities so that they'll get the heck out, so that the wealthy and those who have power can take more land.
That's right.
So people don't want peaceful and safe cities. That would be too nice, because then poor people of color would be able to have a chance to stay and thrive in their neighborhoods that they built that have been taken away from them 100 times. So talk about intersectionality is the intersectionality between police violence and land grab, which we know has happened in the history with Native Americans and many, many other peoples. We see it in Palestine and the militarization and the takeover of the occupied territories as well.
All right. Yes, sir.
My question is to Director Sherrison. How can we have effective change within the Cleveland Police Department when over a third have been convicted of domestic violence or dropped to a misdemeanor, or over a third have been involved in 3 or 4 more uses of use of force or officer-involved homicides, which they may or may not have been acquitted for? And relevant to that, that the administration within the police department either has been in a figurative colloquial relationship in terms of supervision of police union officials in the past in the workplace, or they've had subordinates or been superiors over within the safety department in terms of their work history within the police department. So if you have a colloquial incestuous relationship with superiors in environments or in terms of supervision, how is effective change? And the last part, as we know, since the last 40 years, they've had the Molen Commission in New York with NYPD. They had the Knapp Commission before that. They had the issue with Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia, which was taken over. And of course, we had police chief, black police chief after the LA riots with the LAPD, which they had the largest scandal, which was involved in extortion and drug trafficking. Given all of this in the historical context, how can we not? But the primary issue is many people don't know about employment assistance programs. That many officers have an extreme level of PSTD, and most of them are getting promoted to special operations who have had 4 or 5 shoots or officer-involved killings. Now, given the fact of all of this as an avalanche, can there be effective change relevant to that in that context?
All right. Wow. That's like about 6 questions in there, bro.
Yeah, and I'll just make it very quick. Mr. Jefferson, you should be up on the panel because, I mean, you know these things through and through, and you see the depth of how complicated it is to change an organization that basically started as, the fugitive slave patrols. We're not going to make this thing, nice overnight, and we are certainly not going to make these problems go away. No matter, we had something like a consent decree before, back in 2002, 2004 era, where they did this. Now, last time it didn't have the binding, the court involved to, put the hammer down. The only way this is going to change if the people put the hammer down on this, not a, consent decree, 105-page consent decree. The people have to stay engaged. That means getting engaged with the different groups that are working on these issues. In terms of the police and the PTSD, yes, they have it. I think that's, Officer Brillo jumping up on the roof of the car, coming back from Afghanistan, being in war zones and then coming back and thinking you're still in the war zone. The whole issue of domestic violence and the problems. Now, in Seattle, when they did their consent decree, I think a huge number of officers actually just resigned. They moved out a lot of people. Frankly, I think that needs to be done in Cleveland, and you need to put people who have the community at their center of their heart to come out and do, wonderful work protecting and educated, and not this kind of, militarized police that's an occupation force and that is a harm rather than a help. And I'm not talking about in all cases. I'm just talking about the systems. I'm not talking about the individual officers who are trying to, serve the people. So I know, Mark, I didn't answer all your questions, but again, you should be doing the panel.
Okay, let's keep it moving. Good questions, good answers. Next question.
All right, so I'm going to direct my question to the ladies from SEIU because I've seen you guys work around town, and I know how hard you hit the pavement and how effective your organizing is. So all of these conversations remind us of how much bigger than each of us social injustice is. And when we look at the depth and the breadth and the intersectionality of all of it, I think some of the apathy that we might see in Cleveland has more to do with being overwhelmed. So I want to hear your thoughts on how social justice work, which is work, can be done in a way that's manageable, sustainable, but most importantly, that it's accessible to the people who are impacted by it most, who are often so busy trying to survive that they can't engage in the way that they would like to.
Great question.
I mean, I think I appreciate you raising that question because it is hard, and a lot of times we are disconnected. If you are going to work 2 jobs often, and you have to get home to try to feed your child or to get your kid ready for bed and get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to catch a bus so that you can get to work at 6 or 7, or try to coordinate with the babysitter to be able to get your child's needs taken care of. In between all of that, it is overwhelming and it's hard to do. But every little bit that you are able to contribute, that's what you do. You take it piece by piece. I am all about understanding what that individual's struggle is. You know, we have rallies, we have actions, we want people to come to membership meetings. There's all this stuff that, you know, from our perspective, we know this is, you know, for the greater good for the greater number. But I also understand that people have lives and people have families and responsibilities that are outside of just us. And I think that from a labor perspective, once we start really digging into that and looking at what people are actually facing, you know, we understand that it is beyond our union. It is a problem that our union members have. It's also it's more so a problem that people that don't have a union have. Because if you're talking about a person who is a janitor, if you have a union, the likelihood of you having to work those two jobs is reduced. So that means that you have an opportunity. You have, you know, you have that space to be apathetic to that other worker that does the same thing that you do, that does not have that, because they have to go to work two jobs so that they can just make those ends meet. And I think we have to meet people where they are and find a way and listen to the story and understand what their issue is and understand what their place is, so we can start thinking about how we can work around that. Because it's not just about us in the union, it's about every person that has to actually go to work. So, I mean, I think just understanding where people are and giving an opportunity and accepting whatever little bit they can do. Because every step that you take, every action that you go to, every letter that you write is helping the bigger cause.
Should we, the next question, please. You have.
Just a quick comment about economic justice. As we continue to work for a living wage, which is really important, it's also important to make sure people are financially literate so they understand how to manage their money. Because if I earn $15 an hour, but I don't know how to manage it, I'm really not putting myself in a better position. So financial literacy is important to the economic justice discussion.
All right, thanks for that. Yes, sir.
Yes, to Sister Julia, since you have been so involved lately with all the police shenanigans, and to Sister Nancy, because you're a constitutional lawyer, would it be possible to change the Cleveland City Charter to demand that persons entering the police academy have to be recommended by a city councilman, much as in our national military academies, all persons have to be recommended by a congressman. The point being, I think we could get back to having people from our own communities police our communities.
I would just say, I think that people really need to put all kinds of ideas on the table, all kinds of really creative, thoughtful, you know, like Dr. Angela Davis said yesterday, you know, you got to dream the impossible, because it's hard to even get the possible, but you've got to dream the impossible. And so I think that all options should be considered to make I mean, it's going to call for a radical transformation. We have to be so careful that we just don't reform and make a more well-oiled machine that does a better job of just, you know, bringing people into the mass incarceration system. It's intersected with so many other issues. We have to be very careful about what we do. But I think all good ideas should be on the table, and people should think creatively. And, you know, certainly the people can change the charter.
You have the next question on this side. I think, well, we're back over here. I've lost myself. I think it's your turn.
Okay. The question would be regarding the Tamir Rice case and the grand jury and the prosecutor's presentation of the evidence to the grand jury. He's tainting the evidence by just bringing in these expert witnesses. How can we get him to? I mean, these expert witnesses that are calling it justified, they're calling the killing justified.
Right.
So that's insane. How can we get him to present the evidence that, like Judge Adrian has said, you know, how can we get him to present that? And one comment would be Don Freeman of the Committee for Social Justice wants to see you all at Heritage Middle School on the 29th, the anniversary of the shooting of Tim and Melissa. Heritage Middle School, 14410 Terrace Boulevard at 3:30, Sunday the 29th. So there's that, because we still need justice for that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in my longer remarks, I definitely had to shout out to Don Freeman, who's been doing this work probably almost as long as I've been alive, maybe more. But, you know, really, please do answer that call. I guess what I would say about that is that at this point, and I think you probably all saw Reverend Jawanza and a group of interfaith clergy from the Jewish and Christian communities that came together on Thursday morning to basically call on the prosecutor to step aside. It is impossible at this point, and I say it is absolutely impossible for him to deal with this case fairly. It is irreparably harmed. The due process has completely broken down. He has now denigrated the very victim whom he is supposed to protect. Now, some people say that, okay, you know, he's representing the state of Ohio. He's not really representing the victim. Rachel is here, Rachel Smith. She's much more of an expert on this. But there are victim rights in this state, and the prosecutor has to treat the victim and the victim's family in a fair and dignified way. And when he tried to say that Samaria was, you know, that her family that was interesting people, you know, it was almost like those people, and that they were economically motivated, it's grotesque. He can no longer prosecute this case, so he needs to step aside, and people need to call his office and tell him that we respectfully request that you step aside and an independent prosecutor be appointed. People are doing that now. Go to Subodh Chandra's website. He's the attorney, local attorney for Tamir Rice. His 2 seminal documents up there that debunk those quote-unquote experts, at least the first 2 and the third one. I mean, all of these quote-unquote experts, and the way this is presented makes a mockery of the concept of due process. And we saw that, of course, out in Ferguson, the way they used the grand jury as a secret trial, and this 2-tiered system of justice where African-American and poor people and people of color, people who can't get attorneys, are indicted like ham sandwiches. And then a police, you can't get an indictment because the prosecutor and the police are, generally speaking, sleeping in the same bed to put everybody else in jail. So enough said.
We have time for these last 2, and we have about 2 minutes, so be mindful, panel, when you respond. You're up next.
Yeah, this is really quick. I was an undergraduate student here in 1960. I'm an old person now, I'm 78. Question is, when the university was fed up with the Cleveland police and how they were handling situations here on the university, on the campus, they formed a new police force. Following up on that last question, is it possible for us in one way or another to form start out new with a new police force like University Circle did? And the other question is it working? I don't know that. I'm not close to the campus anymore. But you get the gist of it.
To answer that briefly and make Brother Bakar happy, I would just basically ask that question back to the people. Is it possible? If you deem it possible, if you can dream it, we can do it. We can do it as a team, but it's going to take everybody out there in the audience and many more beyond that. So can we do it? I think we can, but we need to want it together.
We can do whatever we want.
Yeah, this one is for labor. So given that the exponential mechanization of work, let's take, for example, when Apple was reshoring all this factory work, a lot of that was given to robots. There's been reports of McDonald's completely getting rid of cashier and having everything self-serve or self-order. Is there any movement towards a guaranteed minimum income from SEIU, or will there be in the near future, so we are protected from the vagaries of wage labor, and that we have insurance against a job market that is increasingly, if you look at the workforce, increasingly people are just not even looking for work. That even though the unemployment rate has dropped, the people who have dropped out of the labor pool altogether is up quite a bit. So is there a move for a guaranteed minimum income or something similar that kind of displaces the need to have wage labor and still insures people against losing it?
I mean, again, that is That's a situation where labor and the general community need to get together and work toward it together. If we continue to have the separation of union workers versus regular workers versus these workers over here versus carpenters versus service people, we're not going to get to the real issue. The real issue is a lot of jobs are going to, computers. A lot of jobs are leaving the country completely, and people who are looking for work are fed up because they can't find a job, or they find a job that is not a job that is allowing them to sustain themselves and their families. So we need to think bigger than just the union or just the established labor force. We need to think as a society and think about how collectively we can get together to change the current situation of this country. I think that's one of the things that the Fight for 15 did really well. They started a movement. People, fast food workers in New York City back in 2012 said, you know what? This is bullshit and we need to fix it. And they did. And they rallied and they got out there, and people were afraid and people were concerned about what was going to happen. But that movement helped spark states and cities raising their minimum wage. But, that's not enough, because we've raised the minimum wage, but what other actions are we taking to ensure that working people are able to sustain their lives? And again, it's more than just labor working toward this particular issue. Like we know, labor is on the forefront of a lot of that, and the need to want to be part of a labor community kind of sparks that. But at the end of the day, it would be great if we didn't need unions anymore. It would be great if collectively everybody decided that we need to raise the bottom together, and we're going to do the work together to make that happen. So, I think to answer your question, we need to think bigger than just labor, and we need to think community, and we need to think about restructuring the forces that have this country set up the way that it is.
Okay. We are really out of time, but I'm not going to disrespect you, sister.
Thank you.
I'm going to let you ask your question.
No,
we need a really quick response.
Yeah, I just want to make a statement. First of all, I'm very pro-union. I was one of the youngest union stewards for the Communication Workers for America, but there's a lot of racism in the unions. That needs to be addressed. But I want to make this statement. Next weekend, November 22nd, the 20th to the 22nd, that is the 1-year anniversary of the death of Tamir Rice.
That's right.
There are people coming to Cleveland from all over this country. I don't know if people know this. There's ways to get the information. It's all doing social media. And I think people need to be aware there are going to be children protests. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on next weekend. So I think these people in here want to know that. You can't connect. There's also a Million Women's March being planned for October of 2016. And I think people in here might want to be, involved with that. You can get the information by emailing millionwomenmarch.cleveland@gmail.com.
Thank you for that. And Julia, you have a last.
Yeah, I would just add to that there's a group of Yale Law School students, and Marvin Brown is one of them. He used to clerk for Subodh Chandra, who's the local attorney for Tamir Rice's family. He's now at Yale Law School, and the Yale Law School students are actually looking for youth volunteers 12 and under to participate in a social media campaign where of diverse youth, where they stand with something that says #Is this reasonable? Meaning, is it reasonable to kill a 12-year-old child? And that would be put out on social media, and it will need parents' permission. But if you're interested in that, let me know. And it will be linked to a legal document that the students at Yale are working on that will try to flip the script on the standard, that allows police to claim that this is objectively reasonable, that they put themselves in incredibly dangerous situations and then try to shoot their way out of it, right? They do such silly and stupid actions that they can try to justify it. So is it reasonable? That's going to be a hashtag. And we need people to participate. So if you're interested in that, come see me afterward. We can talk about that. It's intergenerational, it's legal, plus social action on the street. There's a lot of things happening. So hook up, especially for the rest of November, so we honor those who have fallen and who have given their lives to make real change.
All right. Can we get a round of applause for the panel? And I believe at this point, I'm about to turn it back over to Dr. Rhonda so she can give us our instructions for what's going to happen next. Thank you all very much.